The gospel reading for this morning comes from the Gospel of Mark, the lectionary gospel being read by the church around the world on this year. It comes from the 6th chapter. Jesus is in the synagogue, beginning with verse 2. On the Sabbath, Jesus began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands?" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please pray with me. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. If you could have one wish, and you could wish for anything in the world that you wanted, what would you wish for? The word I'm focusing on in the service today is wisdom. It's not only in the liturgy and the scriptures, but in the music as well. It seems good to me to follow a Sunday where we were blessing students and teachers and all who work in schools as schools reopen this month all across the county. It seems good to follow the Sunday when we were blessing students and teachers now with focusing on wisdom, especially since the Bible brings us these stories as our readings for today. And so I want you to think about your own journey through life, and ask the question, who have you known in your journey that was a wise person? Whose wisdom has blessed you? Can you think of someone? Is wisdom valuable for us still? Do we value wisdom? We value style. We value appearance. We value talent. We value fame. Do you value wisdom? Deciding whether or not we value wisdom involves determining what is wisdom, and that's not a simple question. How do you define wisdom? What does it mean to be wise? It's a quick move to say it's a synonym for intelligence, but clearly it isn't. Even a cursory investigation of it shows that wisdom is something beyond strict intellect. It's more than that. And if you research it, you'll find there are a lot of schools of thought, of investigation, that lift up possibilities for what constitutes wisdom. Modern psychology has several schools with a heavy research emphasis now on determining wisdom. I think that's a sign that they find it valuable. And they're lifting up the psychological judgment that wisdom is a collection, a coalescence of certain characteristics in judgment: intellectual humility, appreciation of a broader perspective, sensitivity to social relationships involved, and also an ability to see multiple sides of an issue. Those things coming together make up wisdom, psychologists are suggesting. The classic definition of wisdom, and there is a classic definition going back all the way to Plato and Socrates, you'll find this definition coming forward, and it's that wisdom is the intersection of intelligence with experience. I really like that definition. It works for me, you know. Wisdom is the intersection of intelligence and experience. It just rings true, and a lot of people with a lot of experience like that definition. In the Bible, wisdom is mentioned a lot. The whole book of Proverbs is about wisdom, and Proverbs, which is attributed to Solomon, is clear that wisdom's opposite is folly. Wisdom is contrasted with folly, which is unrestrained appetite, all right? And that's a helpful definition too. In Proverbs, wisdom is intentional choice based on a knowledge of consequences, of outcomes. It's an ability to see ahead of what the consequences will be and to choose accordingly. And the book of Ecclesiastes, which is also attributed to Solomon, lifts up the importance of wisdom as choosing intentionally what one will do because of the consequences. In the Old Testament, wisdom is really personified around King Solomon. Solomon is one of David's sons and the one who is chosen to succeed David on the throne. And so that's why often he's lifted up as the example of wisdom. King Solomon's wisdom is famously illustrated in several stories, and you may be familiar with the most famous one. Solomon, after he's king, two women come to him, and they're both in lamentation. There's a baby, and they're each claiming that this baby is their son. And no one has been there to see or determine otherwise. And they're both vociferous in their claim that the baby belongs to them. And in trying to decide, Solomon says, "Bring me a sword." And when they bring him the sword, he says, "Now cut the baby in half and give half of the baby to each mother." And one mother says, no, just give the baby to the other woman, that's better. And Solomon says, "That's the mother, give the baby to her." It's a text of terror, but it's meant to illustrate his wisdom. But the Bible today brings us another story, the story of how Solomon obtained his wisdom. It's here in 1 Kings chapter 3. You can also find it in 1 Chronicles, and later on in 1 Kings, it's also repeated in a way in a formal prayer. Solomon is coming to be king after intrigues of power and the posturing as to who might be king. It's been determined that David chose before he died, and the text began, as John read it, with the death of David. It's been determined that Solomon now will succeed David on the throne. And Israel and Judah are aligned together. David has announced Jerusalem as the capital, and both the northern part of Israel and the southern part, Judah and Israel, have come together, and they need a smooth transition of power to weld them together into one unified nation. And so Solomon comes to be king in what's meant to be a smooth transition of power that will help them hold these two parts of Israel together. And Solomon's story starts by revealing that Solomon has a proclivity for high places. He's got a thing for the mountains, all right? And he likes to go up to the high places, and particularly to sacrifice there, make sacrifices to God. That's a problem in 1 Kings, because that's where the pagans, where the Canaanites would go and worship. All right, and so I'm going to say tongue-in-cheek here, this is an exhortation to my Tampa Bay friends who keep a place in the mountains not to get too attached to them up there, all right? Remember Solomon, who had to keep being called back home to Jerusalem as the central place for his worship. I'm just kidding you. But it is not kidding about God's call to Solomon to unify the nation in Jerusalem. And as he begins to be ordained, as he begins to be in his coronation assigned to the kingship there, he has a dream. And in this dream, the Lord comes to him and says to him, "Solomon, ask whatever you will what I should give to you." It's a remarkable thing to put before a young king, isn't it? You can imagine what he might have requested: long life, riches, victory in battle. But Solomon doesn't ask for any of those. Instead, he praises God's faithfulness to his father David, and he describes his own situation as being a perilous one. He says, "I'm just like a child, Lord." He's actually an adult. He's married here. But he says in humility, "I'm like a child being asked to govern all of these people, and there are people you have chosen. So help me, Lord, by giving me an understanding mind to govern your people and the ability to discern between good and evil." That equals wisdom. Solomon asked for wisdom. And the Bible says God was pleased. The translations in the Hebrew are very important here. Specifically, what is it that Solomon's asking for? Some translations say an understanding mind, but I like the translations that, moving from the root word of the Hebrew, say Solomon asked for a listening heart. A listening heart. How is a listening heart a part of wisdom? Here, we're talking about something that we associate with the life of the mind, but it's using the sense of hearing and the organ that we associate with life, and they associate it with will and desire and intention, and brings them together. Solomon asked God for a listening heart. This involves a listening heart much more than intelligence. It's the ability to discern with compassion, the ability to hear and to understand the real needs of someone, the ability to discern where the person really is. Earlier, God, in choosing David to be king, looks on David's heart and sees David's character and chooses him. Solomon says, Lord, give me a listening heart. Who do you know that has a listening heart? I'm thinking of Connie Darby this morning. She's at Glory now, but was a part of this community for decades. She lived out her adult life here. Back in the early 80s, when I finally graduated from seminary after too many years there, I came and served as the associate pastor, and I had degrees in everything and knew pretty much nothing. And I was assigned with no experience to teach the Bible here. And one of the folks who showed up in my class was Connie Darby, and that was God's gift to me because she was one of the wisest people I know. She had been teaching for generations. Connie had experience teaching the Bible. And God love her, she would come to my class and sit quietly and listen to the whole class. And then afterwards, she would linger to talk with me about what I had said. And in care, she had heard me, she suggest other areas that I might want to explore. I came to discover that the commentaries that I owned and hadn't opened yet, Connie had purchased ahead of me. She had on her shelves the commentaries that I thought I was quoting from, and she had read them. She was more knowledgeable about the topic than me. And with such gentleness, she would hear where I was stumbling and linger afterwards to encourage me in my teaching and suggest perhaps you might want to focus on that, or have you thought about this clause in the text? She had a listening heart. The listening heart does not just collect information. The listening heart sits at the table of intimacy and is able to acknowledge truth. The listening heart looks for a personal relationship that may be transformative. The listening heart can be aware of beauty and intention. It sees and hears truth in the moment. It sees what God desires that you see. The listening heart is without the filter of ego or arrogance filtering it. It's a prayerful listening, a listening towards seeking God's guidance as discernment. It's wisdom. Who's the wisest person you knew? Jesus had a listening heart. The Gospels are full of illustrations. He's aware of the woman who touched his garment in her illness when others didn't even see it. Here's the young ruler, the rich young ruler, asks the question and understands the issues for the man behind the questions. He goes to the paralyzed person by the pool who's been there for years and asks them in a way that others haven't discerned, do you want to be healed? He kneels and draws in the dust when accusers stand around a woman caught in adultery and says, let the one without sin cast the first stone. Jesus had a listening heart, and the Gospels describe him as wise. We cannot develop a listening heart unless we listen to the needs of our brothers and sisters around us. A listening heart has to be able to be vulnerable in humility. A listening heart must know when to speak and when to allow for sacred silence. A listening heart is ready to learn from the good teacher, Jesus Christ. So today we hear the exhortation from the stories of the Bible that we're called also to develop a listening heart as a part of our faithfulness. How? How do we develop this? Well, Solomon prayed for it. And he was pretty wise. He prays for a listening heart. Kenny's going to lead us in a unison reading in a minute from Ephesians. It's the lectionary reading for this month. I experience it as a kind of prayer, a prayer for the gifts in our life outwardly that nurture a listening heart within us, that nurture God's gift of wisdom.